This is naming simple compounds in chemistry. Today you will learn how to convert between the chemical formula of an inorganic compound and its name. So in chemistry, there are basically two types of simple or inorganic compounds that can be formed. First up, we have ionic compounds. Ionic compounds are made up of an anion and a cation. An anion is an ion with a negative charge, and a cation is an ion with a positive charge. An anion is typically going to be a metal, and a cation is typically going to be a nonmetal. So in case you forgot, here is the periodic table. The metals here are all colored blue, and the nonmetals are colored brown. So the biggest rule that you have to remember with ionic compounds is that the net charge of the compound must equal 0. For example, we have SrCl2, and if we break that into its ions, we have Sr2 plus and 2Cl minus, and if you add up the charges, that equals 0. So what are the rules for naming ionic compounds? The cation is always written first, and then you drop the last syllable, sometimes 2, in the name of the anion, and you add the suffix IDE. So what does that look like? For example, HCl is made up of a hydrogen and a chlorine, and that becomes hydrogen chloride. MgBr2, magnesium bromide. Now we also have ionic compounds with transition metals, and the rules are a little bit different. So what is a transition metal? It is a metal that can form more than one ion. So if we look on the periodic table, these right here in yellow, those are transition metals. So therefore, if our ionic compound contains a transition metal, we need to specify which ion we are talking about. And we do this by assigning a Roman numeral to that metal. Now there are other ways to name transition metals by using their Latin names, but you don't have to worry about that for general chemistry. So for example, iron can form two common ions, Fe2 plus and Fe3 plus, which we would name iron 2 and iron 3 respectively. For example, CuBr, that contains a transition metal. Copper is a transition metal, so we have to identify it as copper 1. So that would be copper 1 bromide. Next, we have ionic compounds with polyatomic ions. So polyatomic means 2 or more atoms. Therefore, a polyatomic ion is a group of atoms that has an overall ionic charge, and that is usually negative. So here's a list of a bunch of common polyatomic ions. And what we do is we follow the same rules for naming ionic compounds, but instead we just substitute in the names of the polyatomic ions. So I'll show you what that means. For example, NaNO3, that is just a sodium and a nitrate. So sodium nitrate. K3PO4, potassium phosphate. NH4Cl, NH4, that is ammonium, Cl is chloride or chlorine, so that would become ammonium chloride. NH42SO4, ammonium sulfate. Pretty straightforward. So molecular or covalent compounds are also another inorganic compound, and they are made up of two nonmetals. To name them, you name the elements in the same order that they appear in the formula, and you drop the last syllable, sometimes 2, of the final element, and add IDE. So this is just like ionic compounds. The difference is that you're going to add prefixes to the name of each element to indicate the number of atoms. So these are the prefixes, and as you can see, it is by convention we omit the mono prefix for the first element, and I'll show you what that means. So for example, CO, that is 1 carbon and 1 oxygen. That'd be carbon monoxide, but we don't put mono for the first element. N2O5, that is 2 nitrogens and 5 oxygens, so that would be dinitrogen pentoxide. And lastly, we're going to briefly be talking about acids. So we have HF here, and you'll notice that HF is an ionic compound made up of H plus and F minus. So you might be tempted to call this hydrogen fluoride. It's actually called hydrofluoric acid. So these are the rules for naming binary acids. Firstly, what is an acid? You'll learn more about acids later, but for now you can think of it as a substance that donates hydrogen ions. And they're easily identifiable because they typically start with H. So you're going to add the prefix hydro in front of the nonmetal and then modify the N to IC. For example, HCl would be hydrochloric acid. H2S would be hydrosulfuric acid. And make sure to remember that this rule only applies to binary acids or anions that end in IDE, and there are other rules for other acids.